Hey everyone, it's Sleepy Reader, aka Damien. I am here with my comic book countdown of the comic books, the new comics that I got at my comic book store on January 19th. I actually got 18 comics, and I'm just going to talk about 12 of them because that's all I read. But before I get too deep into it, I did want to mention that that I was on a podcast called Meanwhile at the Podcast, which I've been on a few other times, most recently with Rasa and Terrence, where we talked with the host George about our floating comic book chat. But this time it was just me and George, and we just talked comics. We talked about George Perez. We talked about the hashtag on Twitter we're using to count how many comics we read this year. We talked about collecting comic book art and the current state of prices in original art collecting, and lots of other topics. So anyway, it's a great place to go if you want to hear me and George blather more about comics, which presumably if you're watching this video, you like to hear people just talk about comics. So I will put the link to that episode down below. Meanwhile, the podcast is very eclectic. It's kind of a hanging around the water cooler type of show normally, with different guests showing up sometimes, and then a regular gang of people. In the previous episode, they had one that I was very interested in, an astronomy professor who they chatted with about a bunch of things, including astronomy and the Wheel of Time and other things like that. So in other news, I've just broken out this microphone that my wife gave me for Christmas. I thought my other microphone that I can plug into this iPad was breaking down, and it had kind of fallen apart, and I put it back together, and for a while there was a buzzing, but now it seems to work pretty well. But I'm glad to have another microphone too, and I may also experiment with plugging this into my computer. I haven't read the instructions yet, so there may be more things I can play with the sound on it, or not, I don't know. So I read everything from the comics I picked up last Wednesday. I read everything I was caught up with, and it happened that this particular week, a lot of comics came out, including a lot that I had kind of let a couple of issues slide. So I thought I'd just show you the ones I've been letting slide and should catch up with. There's Regarding the Matter of Oswald's Body. What's the Furthest Place from Here? What is this, issue 3? And I haven't read any of the issues of this. I haven't read any of the issues of Batman versus Bigby. It sounded really good to me, particularly listening to Sean Minutia Minute talk about it. So I decided to pick it up in single issues, but I haven't gotten around to reading it. Batman, I guess, at the moment is low on priority. Supergirl World of Tomorrow. I think I'm 3 issues behind on this. I kind of let it slide. Love the art. The story was so-so. Primordial, I just accidentally let this slip. It looks great, and I look forward to reading it. Kanto, I think I misplaced an issue of Kanto, and so I'm either 2 or 3 issues behind. This was a series that I was enjoying a huge amount. So maybe I'll find time to do a catch-up video at some point for those who care to hear my thoughts on things I've been lagging on the reading. So, but that still left me with 12 comics, which is probably more than enough because I have all these back issues and trades I'd also like to get to. I've been doing this on YouTube, not on YouTube, on Twitter. You can follow me at SleepyReader666 on Twitter. I post there pretty often, and usually about comics. I joined in on this hashtag my 500 comic goal, which people did last year. I guess the idea was to see if you could read 500 comics in a year. But I mostly saw it as kind of a fun way to just remind yourself to post everything you're reading on Twitter as a way to keep track of it. So this beginning of January, I jumped on that. I think I'm up to my 52nd comic so far, which sounds like a lot, but it really just comes to 2 comics a day. So I think although I don't always read a comic every day or 2 comics every day. Over the course of a week, I read 2 comics a day. So if I read 12 comics, and actually some of these took longer than your average comic. If I read 12 comics, that means I'm probably only going to read about 2 back issues that week. So really I think I want about 8 or 9 comics a week, new comics, and then mix in some back issues and stuff. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. The lowest comic on my list here, there was a lot of good comics here, I guess, and a good number that I wasn't super thrilled with. I guess when you get 18 comics, you're going to get a lot of good ones and a lot of mediocre ones, and a few that just aren't right for you. So this one, Bolero, came out an extra thick issue. It's what do you call it? The special binding, perfect bound or something. The square binding on a magazine, and it was $6. I picked it up just because it was a first issue, and I liked the title, and a quick flip through, the art seemed pretty good. It literally just was not for me. It's about I don't know, a girl who's probably about 20. She wants to be a tattoo artist. She has her lover who goes back to her high school days, and then they break up. She hangs out with a cool female rock star. She has her heart broken by the original lover, I think, and then wanders off. Someone somehow guides her into this Twilight Zone area where they will send you off to inhabit some other world in the multiverse. Starting to get sick of multiverses, but so many comics have them, I can't blame this for that. But I think just... And not all stories about someone who's young don't work for me, but this one just really didn't. From the way the young people's lives were presented, there's quite a bit of just for warning for other people, because I wouldn't, depending on how young your child is, there's quite a bit of semi-graphic sex in here. No bonheurs, but the rest of it is pretty much there. So buyer beware if you're thinking of like getting this for your 14-year-old or something. Although I think other than that, it might appeal to a teenager most of all. There was a nice twist at the end when she arrives at her first alternate world. I did like that there's this contract that she's given before she goes off on her adventure, and she can never return to her own world, which I think is interesting. So overall, I should have liked this. I just, because of the characters, did not click with me, and I kept putting it down and coming back to it. It was one where I think I read the opening sequence 3 times before I realized, I've already read that opening sequence. It just didn't click with me, and I'm not quite sure why. It's interesting that it is lettered by my 2021 favorite, Brandon Graham did the lettering. This artist, Luana Vecchio, seems like someone to watch. I think she did the colors too. Yeah. So, but Wyatt Kennedy, who did the writing, some guy, that did not click with me for whatever reason. Okay. Then in at number 11 is The Defenders number 5. First 2 issues, particularly the first issue, I was loving this Defenders. The art was just so on spot for me. And there's still some cool art in here. It doesn't seem quite as cool to me as it did originally, and maybe that's just because the story wore me down. It's just a whole bunch of cosmic noodling with a whole bunch of why should I care and why can't I click with these characters and stuff, because I love Doctor Strange and I dig the idea of Harpy, and Silver Surfer was in here for a while, but it didn't connect with me. It's written by Al Ewing, and I'm starting to wonder if Ewing is someone who I overrated. I thought, after like the first half of the Immortal Hulk run, I thought, I want to read anything written by Al Ewing, but that has not worked out so well. And the Immortal Hulk run, while not horrible, kind of fizzled in a number of spots. And so I think he's often a writer who writes stuff that is too abstract and noodly without enough connection for me, for the character or for even the meaning of events. But I still should keep an eye on what he's doing, right? Because if whatever the mojo was in that early Immortal Hulk comes back, I wanna jump on that. Okay, and then I have misplaced my copy. It was the first comic I read this past week. The comic was called The Instruction for Making a Proper Offering to Forgotten Gods. But I think it came out when I put it in CLZ as Night Janek, which is what the main character is called in here. Although on the cover it says a Jim the Knight adventure. So I don't know if we haven't met Jim the Knight yet, or they meant to call Night Janek Jim the Knight, but forgot to change it in certain parts of the comic, because this comic is by a bunch of Polish creators. So perhaps it was been translated from Polish. It was kind of fun. It was kind of it seems like back in the 80s in fantasy novels, there were a lot of super light fantasy novels that were kind of lightly comedic and just played with the cliches of a fantasy adventure. And that's what this seemed to me. Hey, I'm the hero. I'm going to go do heroic things. And I have a witch that's giving me advice. And some other sidekicks are going to show up. And so there was all that. And it just didn't, again, kind of click with me. Even though that kind of story done in certain ways can click with me. And then on top of that, the art and the coloring, in particular the coloring, just kind of pushed me away. So again, it was by Behemoth, an interesting thing to pick up and give a try to, but I don't think I'll continue with it, at least not now. I could see, like, if I find it for free on Hoopla or something like that, on the digital app, where the colors will probably look better and I have nothing, I just feel like something really light to read some night, I might whiz through it if it eventually shows up on Hoopla. And then my number 9 pick, which I liked quite a bit more, so we're getting more into the realm of things that I really enjoyed, is called Knight's Vengeance, and it's from Scout Comics. I have to salute Scout for the quality of their covers, the quality of the paper. This also, plays around with cliches of fantasy, and is it a light fantasy or a more sort of heavy dark fantasy? It's basically a heavy dark fantasy, but the art style is very cartoony and fun, and the coloring wants to be cartoony and fun, but it also is dark at the same time, which I think didn't quite work again for me, Mr. Picky about color. But I found it kind of an interesting read. It seemed like just a brief opening to a story. We have a Dark Lord, and we have a king who's obsessed with defeating the Dark Lord. And in this issue, he tries to defeat the Dark Lord and fails. And that's a setup for something to come. We're not sure yet. So I think this would have ranked higher for me if they set up a little more in this setup issue. If I see it on the rack, I'll probably pick it up again. I found it at my secondary bookstore, the bookstore I go to after my main bookstore, comic book store, Books with Pictures, and they usually stock up on more of these unusual comics. So I was not totally in love with it, but I would like to try one more issue. An interesting art style and interesting concept. So then at I feel tired already from talking about comics. It's only been a mere 15 minutes. But I'll re-energize with some of this almost no-calorie drink. My next pick at number 8, I enjoyed Shudder a lot. with the big thing I sort of say more and more about this, the stories are totally silly. They barely feel like, even though they have a horrific ending, they barely feel like horror stories anymore because I just sort of know exactly how they're going to go, and they're kind of silly. But lots of great art in here. Reno Manqui, what's this fellow's name? Santos Zablos. Other people should be snapping up these artists. Carlos Lamani. Who's this fellow? Mansur Daman. This Mansur Daman had quite the. It reminded me a bit of Val Mayrick, a really nice style. So, yeah, I think it's a mild irritant to me to have all this great art and the potential for telling a variety of horror stories, but they all kind of amount to the same thing by the time you get to the final panel with their very silly forced twists. But I'm enjoying it. I will keep subscribing to Shudder. They get my money. And for those who don't know, Shudder is basically the Creeps renamed. So I think finally their use of the Warren Comics names, or names so close to Warren Comics that would confuse people, Creepy the Creeps, by Warrant Publishing. They're still called Warrant Publishing. That must have caught up to them. So they renamed the Creeps Shudder, and now they have Aunt Shudder, I think is her name, as the Auntie Shudder as the intro lady. And yeah, it's good. I think the difference is the Warren Comics expanded, grew, tried different things, and they're just sort of stuck in one groove. I enjoyed Hulk quite a bit. Hulk number 3, or Hulk number 770 in legacy numbering, by Donny Cates and Ryan Otley and Frank Martin. It's just a fun, zany package. We're in the multiverse again, so I don't want to spend too much time thinking of it. Of course, we meet another Bruce Banner who has a very different history and relationship to his world, and I found that interesting. There's a certain kind of thing you have to accept with Marvel Comics. I think with something like the Hulk, it's going to endlessly be about the relationship of the Hulk and Bruce Banner, the psychology of Bruce Banner, his damaged personality, and his struggles or to have a control or lack of control over the Hulk. I put this at number 7. I think I might have ranked it higher if more happened in this issue. It was a super quick read. Although I should expect that from Donny Cates. He specializes in these very quick, flashy reads. Okay, and then something completely different here. And I really wasn't sure where to rank in my own... what was my own amount of pleasure in reading Laura. This is Laura issue 3. I guess it's the final issue. This is called Laura and Other Stories. So Laura was the first 2 issues. They probably figured they needed at least 3 issues to pad it out to be thick enough to be a trade to sell in the American market. So, because they are advertising a hardcover trade at the back. I have not read Laura. I started the first issue, the story Laura, and I just wasn't interested, maybe similar to my lack of interest in Bolero. Reading this issue, which is just 2 short stories that have nothing to do with Laura as far as I know, makes me kind of curious to go back and read Laura, because they are more meta. They are more about being a comic book artist, or about... one of them's about being a comic book artist. One is about being an artist, period. And both involve perhaps Gilliam Marsh's over-obsession with the female body. And in one of these, called Irene the artist, I think. Anyway, Irene is a comic book artist, and this is just a free-form, wild little dreamlike ride where she meets Hayao Miyazaki, and they fly off in Porco Rosso's airplane, and Miyazaki critiques her approach to doing comics and taking the easy road. He critiques her for doing just slice of life because she does that because it's easy, and for just drawing the things that she finds easy to draw. And they have a little argument where she says, well, I put your airplane in here because that's your Porco Rosso airplane because that's more of a challenge to draw. Then they land on this beach, and he says, of course, a beach with barely dressed girls and umbrellas, exactly the things you like to draw. And then during the course of the conversation, she turns from Irene into Guillermo Marsh wearing Irene's bathing suit. And so this is partially about that these slice of life comics starring female characters are really autobiography of Guillermo Marsh, which makes me view Carmen in a whole different point of view. And then the second story is called Muse, and it's all about, I assume, Guillermo Marsh's real life experience with a roommate. He's looking for a nude model, and after a whole bunch of back and forth and innuendo and stuff, she decides to be his nude model. I've just spoiled it, I'm sorry. But the fun is just in the back and forth with it. The woes or interests of Guillaume Marsh are of only small interest to me. It was kind of fun, though, to get this behind-the-scenes kind of thing, which makes me think I should just try Laura a little more. So at first I thought, well, this is such a unique comic and interesting take on the life of the creator that I should rank this higher. But then just trying to be honest with myself, because this is totally subjective about my enjoyment, did I enjoy this more than the 5 comics above it? No, the 5 comics above it, there were 5 more comics that I had more fun reading, even though some of them were extremely unique. Some of them maybe did not strike as unique and interesting a tone as Laura. I'm certainly glad I stuck with Laura, even though I didn't read the first issue, that I got to read this issue. Oops. Okay, in at number 5, I am putting Aerosmith. Another one that I had a little trouble reading. I picked it up, started it, didn't initially get into it, and then picked it up again later, and sort of pushing my way through it, I started to really get into it. And it's takes place sort of on the front lines of this universe's version of World War I, with magic and dragons and all kinds of different alternate history. I don't think the U.S. became had a revolution against the British. I don't think. I own, but I have yet to read the previous Aerosmith comics. But I really enjoyed the part of the comic that took place in England, sort of during a wartime furlough type of thing, and just the conversations with this guy made out of rock, and the problems that the American hero and the guy made of rock had with these British officers at a pub who didn't want lowlifes hanging out at their pub or their restaurant. And then intrigued as we find out what our hero's mission is. I think his name is Aerosmith. Is that why it's called Aerosmith? I wasn't even quite sure. And as I read this more, I came to really love the unusual colors provided by Jose Villalobos. At first, I was not Villarrubia. And Carlos Pacheco is a very pleasing, if solid, middle-of-the-road artist. And solid and middle-of-the-road is what I'd kind of call this. And maybe why I didn't get into it at first is because it's not written in the style of current comics. It's the side of the good writers in the late 80s, 90s, the ones who weren't writing the flashy Todd McFarlane, Rob Liefeld type of comics, but that built up a story in a kind of solid, deliberately paced way, rather than modern comics, which I realize play a lot of tricks. Old comics play a lot of tricks too, a lot like starting in media res, as they so often do. But this is a more, I don't know, novelistic way, perhaps, an old-fashioned adventure novel way of setting up a story. So I enjoyed it quite a bit once I managed to get into it. Very enjoyable, written to be a very fast read. Very comparable to a issue of Ice Cream Man, I think, is this issue of Silver Coin called Rising and Falling in America, written by Matthew Rosenberg. Fantastic art by Michael Walsh. I'm appreciating Michael Walsh more and more. I don't have this on my pull list since it's one and done stories, and when I read the first 5 issues, I didn't see like some continuing thread about the Silver Coin at all, or even any consistency about it. I decide, well, I can just pick it up when I'm intrigued by who's writing it or something I hear about it. I heard about this from Rockin' Robbie Billups on his pop culture podcast, Pop Culture Philosophers, his Tuesday review. He made this his number 1 comic of the week. I think it was a very good choice. Not my number 1, but very good. But I put it at number 4. A very enjoyable horror story. Almost a straightforward narrative as we see someone become corrupted by a magical coin. But just done just right so that you really enjoyed reading it. A nice short story. Nothing to change comics or change horror stories, but very well done. Okay, we're getting near that top. I am still loving a righteous thirst for revenge from Rick Remender, from the artist who is fantastic and whose name I have trouble pronouncing, Andre Lima Arroyo. I don't know. But he is brilliant, so I should learn how to say his name. I think I've heard discussions of how to say his name on Jared Osborne and Company's Cavern of Chaos, so I should have been paying closer attention. Anyway, this is a little bit more of a wordy issue, and we're getting a little bit more sense of a kind of underworld that is, at least in the world here, which I think does this take place in Vancouver, BC, or somewhere in Canada? But it's probably an international thing. A really creepy underworld of abusing women and killing and the dark internet and various things like that. So, yeah, I'm not sure what to say without spoiling too much. But again, all the characters are done very well via the art, and obviously there's a whole iceberg. You know, we're seeing the tip of the iceberg, and there's a whole story beneath the water. The only thing that could maybe ruin this for me is if, when the whole story is revealed, it's kind of stupid, or if they just never really explain the whole story. But still excellent work for me. I've heard some other people say it fell off, but I'm not sure why they said that. I guess as it gets more characters, more complicated, maybe it gets more confusing, but I didn't feel confused, even though I often feel confused by a lot of comics. Okay, that was my number 3. I'm up to my number 2 and number 1. In a way, my number 2 is my number 1. So it's kind of 1B and 1A, because in any normal week, this was totally my number 1 comic. It was really excellent. And amongst the normal comics in this list, it's by far the best. And it's hard to judge it with the one that was my number 1, which will become apparent in a few minutes. But so Usagi Yojimbo, number 25, the beginning of a 2-part story. You could start reading it right here. There's something it's not a complicated story, but there's something just so well done about it. Usagi and his cousin are wandering through the countryside. They're chatting about things. We get the landscape. They pass some creepy people. There's a tense moment. It's just all so well conveyed in the art and the dialogue without hitting any of their points over the head. And then they find some dead and dying people, and everything changes. This idyllic kind of world they're walking through becomes dark and creepy. They split up trying to find the bad guys, and they find a bunch of different things, really. And so by the end of the issue, the story seems much more complicated, but it's still your basic adventure story with bad guys and good guys. But Stan Sakai just hits the notes so well that it just seems so special to me and so important to read, even though it's an adventure story about medieval samurai or medieval ronin in Japan. But it is surpassed in a way, but by something that is just totally out of left field, totally weird, Cursed Pirate Girl. And because of Cursed Pirate Girl, I've decided that I wouldn't worry about showing images on the screen. Like if I went like that, what would you see? So I am gonna take photographs of all the comics I'm talking about, do much more editing than I normally do, and fit them into this video. Cursed Pirate Girl, I don't know where to start. Is it even really a comic? Is it a masterpiece work of art in a somewhat comic book-like form? It also will remind you of children's storybooks, especially like really Baroque, old-fashioned children's storybook illustrations. And it will reminded me of Hieronymus Bosch and Bruegel and Alice in Wonderland and other things that I can't remember, this M.C. Escher at points, and other artists that I can't quite put my finger on. It's like, oh, that feels kind of familiar. But Jeremy Bastian is just going his own way, creating his own thing. It has this retro, old-fashioned feeling to it, but there was nothing actually like this back then. It feels like outsider art, but it also feels like genius art of someone who knows exactly what they're doing. There is a story in here that you can suss out. How important is the story? I'm not sure. There's a twist at the end. I have read some other Cursed Pirate Girl. I had a hardback trade that someone in the community gave me, and I need to go back through my videos and remember who that person was who gave it to me. This took me a lot of time to read. I made many attempts at it. I couldn't just sit down and read it. I had to read a few pages. I often came back, forgot exactly which pages I read, and when I would reread pages, they would read differently each time because there's so much going on in the art. Your eye can travel on different journeys through the art, different times you do it. And you might just say, this guy's crazy and just making a mess. But to me, it seemed like he was purposefully creating all these pathways through the story, through the art. The story is basically that the Cursed Pirate Girl is looking for some magic thing, I now forget what it was, from some mythological, Davy Jones locker type of guy who lives underwater that can bring her father back to life. And at the end of the comic, she brings someone back to life, I guess. And I think I know who it is from my long gone memory of reading the original Cursed Pirate Girl, but I need to dig up that hardback, which is in a box somewhere, and reread that too. But I feel like I will be going through this several more times now that I've realized, hey, I have a different adventure each time I go through one of these pages. It's a little bit like the experience of reading Echolands by J.H. Williams, but it is many times beyond that. And Chris on Chaos and Comics said an interesting thing about Echolands, which was it was truly the kind of thing that you could only do in comics. It was fully utilizing the medium of comics to be something that you just couldn't have in any other medium. And that's kind of the same true here in the sense but I'm not sure if it's a comic. It's a comic-like object of art, but it's something that could only be done the way it's done. It could only be done with all these crazy drawings on paper combined with words, and without the words, it would be a very different experience. And without the intricate details and all the seemingly extraneous stuff going on in every page, it would be something else entirely. It is its own thing because of the medium and the approach and everything like that. So I really enjoy this. I need to find time to, treat it more like a coffee table book, pick it up, take in a page or two, pick it up again, take in the same page a few days later and experience it in a different way. So it made my week really fun and interesting, but it was like hard work.